Okay, so now we're into Tuesday in our Wes Craven week, and like I said, we're jumping around with the timeline a little bit, so now I wanted to talk about The Serpent and the Rainbow, which is an interesting thing to talk about because the first time I saw this movie, I had borrowed it from a friend. I borrowed a lot of stuff around the time, like Reanimator and Dead Alive and stuff like that. It was all the first time I'd seen those. It was the same friend that introduced me to like Romero's movies and stuff like that, and Fulci. And this one, I don't know if it was because I was comparing it to those or what, but at the time, I just wasn't really that into this one. And I just kind of dismissed it for a long time as, oh, well, that's just kind of Craven will have hits and misses, whatever. And then I just kind of never went back to it. I think I might have felt bored by it also. I was probably 14 or 15 by this point. And so I revisited it relatively recently, like in the last year or so, or last year or two or so, and found something completely different. And I realized how much I had come around on it and how much I was really underrating it, to the point that it makes me wonder how many other people are severely underrating it, especially amongst Craven's filmography, because there's just so much wild creativity in it that we can go to. The first thing is, I think this Blu-ray was released shortly after he died, like sometime in the next year. So there is a nice dedication to him at the beginning before it starts, before the Universal logo and stuff like that. Talking about it now as a movie, it's starting off with this sort of grounded reality that we kind of start in, which the more grounded in reality it is, the better, because of how fucking crazy the second half gets, particularly the third act. But before we get into all that, yes, there is this opening where we see, Bill Pullman, and we get what his assignment is, and it starts off as what essentially feels like a detective movie in a sense. It helped a lot by his narration, and he's kind of, explaining what his objective is and what this drug is potentially capable of and what's going on with the supposed zombies and stuff like that, and it really puts it in this sort of scientific reality. And then you get the sense that we're going to gradually get more supernatural, but in the meantime, well, first off, it starts off with this scene of Christoph getting buried, and it sets this very reality-based fear is going to be the focus for a bit, which is being buried alive and not being able to do anything, especially when we learn later that the drug wears off after 12 hours. And then you're stuck down there completely. You come back to reality completely in your body, and it's too late. And that in itself is this very frightening thing, and like I said, based on reality. I don't know how many people I've talked to, even though it's probably an irrational fear, I don't know how many people I've talked to that say that being buried alive is something that they think about often, and it's like a fear that's really deep-seated in them. So there's a real fear when they meet Christoph in the cemetery, and he's talking about what he felt as it was happening, and the words that he uses are, "the darkness pressed me down," which is just a really creepy and eerie sentence. Yeah, that's kind of what the focus is here, and then when Pullman comes over, we kind of have this sequence, or a couple of sequences at least, that sort of feel like the first act scenes of Altered States, where it's just kind of him sort of doing his research, but we get these really trippy scenes where he takes the drugs, and he's already in this foreign land, and he's surrounded by what's already the unknown to him, and then starts having these visions, and of course these visions are going to become more and more intense and more of a reality, potentially, as the story goes on. So it's a great setup for those, but also just kind of sets the mood for what's going on here. But like I said, the fact that it feels like it sets the vibe that it's just a drug-induced state is also going to kind of setting up that line of what's, a drug-induced state and what's reality, and how much that line's going to blur as the movie goes on. But in the meantime, everything seems more or less harmless here. There's him hanging out with the Jaguar, and then there's that great cut where it's just Pullman rolling around on the ground by himself and stuff like that. It feels very light, but then quickly becomes horror, like when he starts having visions of Petrod in his, drug-induced state, and then he's pulled into the ground, and it's like I said, they're really setting up early what the whole vibe of the movie is going to be, but even then, you're still not quite prepared for how far we're going to go as it goes on, which is fantastic. And another thing I love on top of the... When I said it felt like there was a sort of detective element with his narration and this sort of investigation aspect and interviewing people and stuff like that. Naturally, that means there's also going to be a mystery element that's really appealing. So we get... It's interesting when you think about the plot, where it's like somebody is potentially making zombies. And they talk about, like, is there another word you want to use besides zombie? Or, like, we know how ridiculous this sounds. And it's like, yeah, when he goes into it, it does feel like the sort of darkest Scooby-Doo episode ever, is what it sounds like it's setting up. And then, yeah, as he goes in and he further investigates, we start to get, like, conspiracy elements also. So I love how grounded the story feels. Now, as far as it being, like, actual reality, it is one of those movies that tells you that it's based on true events. And what little research I was able to do brings up what I feel like most people expect when they look up the, in quotes, true stories of horror movies, especially horror movies that are this wild. A lot of it is going to be fabricated. A lot of it's just going to be a movie. With little elements here and there that were kind of a jumping off point. I don't really know the contents of the book that it's supposedly based on, but I was able to look in and find that, the author that Pullman's character is based on, not a whole lot came of this investigation and the drugs and all that, and the stuff that they talk about, like at the end especially, when it comes up and says, like, it's still being, studied and all that, and whatever the possibilities are, and it's like, by 2 years before this movie came out, that drug was already pretty well known, and I guess these days it's like used as an anesthetic. But like there's a few characters here who are loosely based on real people that he had run-ins with, but it's I think it's widely seen as a pretty fictional movie. Like I said, there's just these little elements that were in real life that were used as jumping off points. It's like when just this year we had Cocaine Bear, where it was like, yeah, what's the very first thing that set off everything that happened? Yeah, that really happened, but everything after the fact, like everything after the first minute and a half, is all just a movie. And I'm willing to embrace something like that. Like I don't think anything should be held against this movie for like. Because I would like to think, I know there's a lot of people that really want to believe a lot of things, but I feel like pretty quickly while watching this movie you can realize that, I'm going to assume most of this is not an actual true story or anything like that. The only thing that feels genuinely deceitful, I think, is the text at the end. Where it's like they talk about the drug as if it was still a big mystery at the time when it wasn't. So there's that. But regardless, like I said, I still appreciate the reality that the movie sets up, even if the movie has its own sort of fictional world that it's kind of set up. And going into that, he also has interactions with these people. The one that will stand out, of course, is Kathy Tyson, who kind of becomes his partner in this. And there's a lot of great stuff with her. The character has this likability to her, like she can have a laugh and stuff like that, like in the graveyard when like jump scares get him, when the grave robbers come out and stuff like that. There's a mysterious quality to her when we see her interacting in like the show, and there's like the possibility that she gets possessed almost just for the fun of it. It feels like, I mean, it feels very ritualistic, of course, but that kind of throws in this sort of mysterious wrench into her that maybe could have been a little bit more explored. This movie was initially 3 hours, apparently, before they cut it down to an hour and a half, so that was probably more explored at some point, but just adding just a little bit of a mysterious quality to her is good enough for me, honestly. And just the idea in general, we kind of get past this in the second half, but kind of the first half, there is this idea, especially after the possession scene, of is she trustworthy or not? Becomes an interesting question. Like I said, especially with the whole conspiracy angle that's kind of surrounding all this stuff. We do eventually get to a point where we set all this up, it's got a mystery angle, it's got a conspiracy angle, we meet all the characters. We eventually get to that moment that, people investigating often get to, where it's the big centerpiece moment where they realize they're in too deep. And this is the moment where Petra has him and is torturing him and stuff like that. All stuff that you would see in a movie based in reality. And then right around that point, when we get to it feels like the movie is about to end. Basically, like I can almost see that as a criticism that people would probably throw out is this movie reaches a point where it could conceivably just end, where he gets the drug, and he has this whole thing with Mozart where they come to the agreement, and then he goes home, and then right around the time he goes back home is when all shit breaks loose, and this movie becomes completely unleashed. And it really brings in those supernatural elements that it feels like it's been gradually building to this whole time, where like they come in and it's like, oh, he's having dreams, or oh, it's a drug. But then, like I said, eventually that line gets completely blurred, and you don't know where we are at any given time as far as inside a dream, inside a drug-induced state, or is this actually happening? And it just gets wilder and crazier. The great thing about this movie also, when I talk about it being sort of underrated, is this has to contain some of Craven's most, like, wild and memorable imagery. Like, you could run down the whole list, where it's like, I love the addition of the sorceress, who kind of became the centerpiece of the cover for the Scream Factory cover here, where obviously we've been setting up the idea of zombies and stuff like that, and that's like, and possession, and that's the kind of supernatural thing we're doing. But the way the sorceress's decomposed corpse is covered in that veil, and we get multiple shots of that, and how sometimes she'll come out of the darkness and just be making, it's barely words, it's just kind of like this otherworldly sound or moaning or something, and it gives a ghost quality. And it's like, it almost feels like one of the only supernatural things we hadn't touched on was ghosts themselves. So I love that the sorceress kind of gives that vibe with the veil, and it feels like, like I said, we're hitting every sort of type of fear, it feels like. We're also hitting like every type of, typical threat you would see in a horror movie. It feels like it's coming out in this. And like I said, the supernatural gates of hell have opened, and like everything comes out in this movie. It's fantastic. There's even stuff like stuff that feels almost dreamlike. Like when during the climax, when he comes through the door, and then like the gravity changes and stuff like that. And that's the kind of stuff where it's like, I love that they embraced both sides of that, where it's like nightmare aspects, which obviously we know Craven can do very well and has a lot of practice in, where you do get the sense of, oh, this is about the scary part that happens in a nightmare that wakes you up and wakes you out of it. But then there's the other stuff like that, the surreal stuff, like when the gravity changes when he opens the door. That also feels like you're in like the deep part of the dream, where you're not like on the verge of waking up yet, but you're getting deeper and deeper into the surreal qualities of the sort of dream world. There's a great moment when Pullman's having one of his vivid dream sequences that may or may not be dreams at this point, but like, almost premonitions or something, or Petra getting into his head, but when he has the dream of being trapped in the coffin and the blood coming out, which feels like this sort of iconic horror image at this point. But there's the moment where he's like in the box and there's nothing underneath, and then suddenly the bottom rises and he's in this very confined space as the blood starts to come in. The way they play with like all the different kinds of fears in this is insane. There's also Paul Winfield's character, who, to my understanding, Paul Winfield's character and Brent Jennings' character, Mozart, were, like, it was one person in real life that kind of got split up into two characters. And Paul Winfield's fate in this, he has two fates, because that's the kind of wild movie we're in. The scorpion out of the mouth is one thing, but I was saying to somebody recently, the moment where, after, Petra has Paul Winfield's soul, and then he pulls his head off and throws it at Pullman, that effect of him pulling his head off and throwing it feels like something that would be out of, like, Carpenter's The Thing. It's that wild. When we're getting into The Thing comparisons, this movie has reached a very wild state. And I love that so much. And talking about this dinner scene, when, like I said, he goes back home, and you would think that it feels like it's the end of the movie. So it kind of puts you, it gives you this sort of sense of security, where it's like, yeah, he's back with his, scientist friends, and he's got the drug, and they're talking about it, they're talking about the possibilities and what it does and all that. They're talking about it in this very real way, this grounded way. And then this hand starts to appear, and then that's one of those things where you almost realize, it's like one of those things where you feel like you've woken up from a nightmare, but you've actually still been in it the whole time. It's that kind of feel. And then this scene breaks out that would be right at home in like an Exorcist movie, where the wife starts to chew the glass like we've seen before, and then she has Petra's voice, and this whole sort of possession scene happens, and then we realize this is just the tip of the iceberg of us reaching the end of the story. And like I said, it goes from there. When we thought we were safe and we're ending, that we get the craziest shit that the movie has. Which, like I said, feels like Craven completely unleashed. And just every single bit of imagery you could throw into this. And it doesn't feel gratuitous either. They've really set up the very supernatural world, the very nightmare feeling, feel of this world. And like I said, that just adds to a fun factor to it. When you can get to a point where you've set up your story enough that you can just go crazy in the third act and just throw anything and everything at the protagonist and the viewer, really, in horror imagery, that's basically the perfect sort of horror ride that you want when you go into a movie like this, especially when you go into a Craven movie. And then there are other aspects apart from that I still love. There was I mentioned Brent Jennings, who I especially want to praise as far as performances go, where he plays like this perfect sort of con man type for like the first half of his performance. And I love the way they turn this around, where he feels like the perfect sort of con man character for a while, and then when it shows that he can actually do the things that he said he can do, we see just how we get like a whole other side of the character, and this sort of brilliant side of the character. And there's the moment when Pullman even says he'd give any Harvard PhD a run for his money, talking about this stuff and working and making this drug and all that. And the way Jennings is able to play both sides of that, like the sleazy con man and the guy that knows exactly what he's talking about and is kind of a genius in his own right, is perfect. And that scene they have on the plane where they kind of come to their understanding, which ultimately ends up making Mozart's death feel very tragic, which is something we may not have felt would happen or was possible to feel about that character when we first met him. Brent Jennings is fantastic in this. So another thing that's fantastic in this is the locations and the contrasting locations, because we've been pretty much this whole time I've been talking about the contrast of the grounded reality and the supernatural and the nightmarish stuff. So I like that the locations really bring this into focus also, where we have where it feels like sort of a generally dangerous environment. Obviously one of the famous things about this movie is the fact that the production had to move to the Dominican Republic because the cast and crew were like not safe as things were starting to break out. And you get that vibe regardless of like whether it was in reality as they were shooting or kind of trying to recreate that feeling when they moved. You do always get this sense that there's a constant danger looming. Like this just feels like a generally dangerous place that's surrounding them, whether it be the secret police that Petra is the chief of, or all the wild and crazy shit that's coming out, all the supernatural shit. It feels like danger's coming from every possible direction. It feels very grimy. But then there's stuff like there's locations like the waterfall or the house on the beach, and they're like these beautiful, relaxing locations. And like I said, that it kind of also not only is that great for the aesthetic of the movie and shows the contrast, but like I said, something really important that this movie has is that false sense of security whenever it happens. When you think it really is good about setting you in this place where you think, okay, this is kind of our breathing room, but then every time we have like a space for breathing room, what follows is even crazier than what was before. So and that's just how this movie feels, this sort of roller coaster of crazy shit, scary shit, and then breathing room and reality and science, then crazier shit, and then reality and science, and then the craziest shit. And it's like this whole sort of, you can see the acts play out, 1, 2, and 3. And like I said, the way it just gets gradually more insane and more supernatural as it goes. What those bits of reality always coming back into play and making you basically question your sanity is really, really fun. So, I think that's about all I have to say about this one. So, yeah. This is also a movie where I know a lot of it hasn't worked when you look at it, but I feel like there is a place for voodoo horror. When you look at horror movies in general, that never really quite got its day when it could have, because there's so much potential in voodoo horror, and I feel like you especially see that in this movie in particular. But yeah, there were a lot of movies also that kind of went that direction and squandered it. So I don't think it never really took off. But there are movies like this and movies like Angel Heart and stuff like that really showed great potential for voodoo horror that could still be out there. There could be a renaissance for it, and that would be fun to see what people can do it, especially since horror directors, we're getting some pretty creative ones coming out, so, and kind of getting the space to do their own thing. So that would be kind of fun to see a resurgence in that and kind of see it have a particular success before they ultimately drive it into the ground, like they always do with something successful. But yeah, so I guess I can leave this at this, and since we're still in Wes Craven Week, there will be something again tomorrow. And until then, I think that's it.